All right, welcome back to the deep dive. As someone who's in the thick of political life, day in and day out, you've got to have a rock-solid understanding of how things work, the foundations of governance. It's not just about reacting to the latest crisis. It's about really grasping the nature of constitutions themselves, and that's exactly what we're going to tackle today.
We're diving deep into a classic text of political thought, implicitly drawing on Aristotle's Politics, specifically Books 4. And what's striking is how relevant these ancient ideas still are to the challenges you face in today's political landscape.
Yeah, it's amazing how these core principles just keep popping up throughout history.
Yeah.
So in this deep dive, we're aiming to give you, the political leader, the tools to see the crucial distinctions between different types of constitutions. We want to cut through the academic jargon, the theories, and get to what really matters, what sets them apart, what keeps them stable, what makes them crumble, and ultimately, which ones might be the best fit for different situations. This is all about getting practical, actionable knowledge you can actually put to work.
You know, at its heart, political science is about grappling with these very questions, understanding constitutions. Just like a coach needs to understand the body to train an athlete, or a doctor needs to understand health to treat patients, a political scientist, and that includes you as a politician, needs a deep understanding of constitutions.
And it's not just about finding some perfect system in a textbook,
Right.
right? There's a lot more to it.
Right, there's a lot more to it. Our source lays out a few key goals. First, exploring that ideal constitution in theory, without the messy realities of the world getting in the way. But then looking at what kind of constitution actually works for a specific city or state, taking into account its own unique context and what's actually achievable. And then something really important for you figuring out how existing constitutions, even those with flaws, actually operate, and how they can be kept going and even improved. And finally, considering if there's a type of constitution that generally fits best for most societies. So we've got the ideal, the practical, the preserving, and the generally applicable.
That general applicability really hits home. It's easy to get lost in chasing the perfect system, but what actually works across different situations. And here's where it gets really interesting. Our source doesn't just stay in that theoretical realm.
What's fascinating here is the understanding that focusing solely on that highest, most perfect constitution, one that might need tons of resources or exceptionally virtuous citizens, isn't always the most practical approach. A lot of places simply won't have the conditions for it. And as you know better than anyone, trying to completely overhaul an existing political system, that can be just as tough, if not tougher, than starting from scratch.
Tell me about it. Anyone who's tried to push through meaningful political reform knows that it's not a simple fix.
Exactly. And that brings up a crucial point for you as a politician. A big part of your job is working within and improving the system you've got, even if it's not perfect. But to do that well, you can't just think in black and white, like with democracy and oligarchy. These aren't one-size-fits-all concepts.
Right. It's not just rule by the many versus rule by the few, and that's it.
Not at all. Our source stresses understanding the different flavors within each of these broad categories and how they can be mixed and matched. And this is fundamental laws should be made to fit the Constitution, not the other way around. It's the Constitution that sets the overall framework, the goals of a political community.
So the Constitution's the big picture, the vision, and the laws are the details within that vision.
Exactly. Now, the text dives into a classic distinction, the difference between what it calls correct and deviant constitutions.
Okay, let's break down that distinction. We're looking at kingship, aristocracy, and what they call a polity as the correct forms. And then tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy as the deviations.
That's the basic categorization. The idea is that the correct forms aim for virtue, for the common good. They assume a certain level of civic virtue from the citizens. But for us today, as politicians in the real world, we're going to focus more on the commonly found ones, those oligarchies and democracies and their variations. And of course, tyranny as the ultimate power grab.
And there's even a hierarchy within those deviant forms, right?
Yeah. Tyranny is seen as the worst offender, rule for the ruler's own benefit. It's like the furthest thing from a true constitution. Oligarchy, where a wealthy minority calls the shots, is considered the next worst. And then democracy, in this view, is the most moderate deviation.
That's interesting, especially since we often think of democracy as the ideal today. What were the source's main concerns that led to that ranking?
The worry is about the potential for things to get out of hand, for the majority to rule without considering minorities or principles of justice. They even present a counterpoint that democracy might be the least bad option when all the other systems are corrupt. But the main takeaway is that these deviations are all flawed in their own way. It's about being less bad, not purely good.
So with that in mind, what are the big questions our source wants to answer about these different forms?
Lots of good questions. First, just how many variations are there within democracies and oligarchies? Second, what's the most realistic type to achieve? And what's the next best option after that ideal form we talked about? Third, is there a well-structured constitution that just works for most states? Fourth, which constitutions are a better fit for different types of people or societies, considering their specific characteristics and values? Fifth, how do you actually set up and maintain these different types? And finally, what causes constitutions to fall apart and how can they be preserved, both generally and in their specific forms? These are questions that every leader grapples with.
Absolutely. These are the questions that keep political leaders up at night, figuring out the lay of the land, what's possible, and how to build something that lasts. So where does the source start to unpack all this?
It starts by saying that the reason we have so many different types of constitutions is because states themselves aren't all the same. They're made up of different parts, different groups with different interests and capabilities.
Okay, so we're talking about the different groups and divisions within a society.
Exactly. The basic unit is the household. But beyond that, you've got your economic divisions, the rich, the poor, and that crucial middle class. Then you have differences based on access to military power, which historically was a big deal. And then there are your occupational groups, farmers, traders, craftsmen. Even among the elite, the notables, you find differences in wealth, property, and what they call breeding. Today, we might call it social capital, the influence and connections that come with certain families and social circles.
So these different power centers within a state naturally shape its government to reflect those dominant interests. The text even gives historical examples, right?
It does. For example, it points out how oligarchies tended to pop up in ancient cities where cavalry was the main military force because only the wealthy could afford horses. Think of places like Eretria or Chalcis. The way they fought wars directly influenced their political structure.
So the structure of a society, its economic divisions, its hierarchies, how it defends itself, all plays a huge role in shaping its political system.
Exactly, and you can categorize these differences in broader terms: wealth, social standing, and virtue or merit. The key takeaway here is that constitutions are all about determining who gets the power and influence based on the perceived capacity or equality of these different parts of the state.
And it seems like democracy and oligarchy are often seen as the two main foundational forms, the ones from which others are derived.
Yeah, they're often viewed as the basic binary in political systems. Aristocracy, ruled by the so-called best, is sometimes seen as a type of oligarchy that emphasizes quality over just pure wealth. And polity, which we'll define more clearly later, is often seen as a kind of democracy, maybe a more balanced version. The source makes an analogy with winds north and south are the main ones, and the others are variations. Similarly, they saw democracy and oligarchy as the core, with the others being variations or combinations. But our source suggests we need a more nuanced understanding. They focus on well-formed constitutions versus those that deviate from key principles, with oligarchic forms tending towards more control by a specific group, and democratic forms having more widespread participation, which can sometimes get out of hand.
So as political leaders, we really need to get beyond those simplistic definitions of democracy and oligarchy, the ones you hear in sound bites.
Definitely. The text tackles that head-on. It challenges the idea that democracy is simply rule by the majority, and oligarchy is just rule by the minority. It gives some really thought-provoking examples. Imagine 1,000 rich people systematically excluding 300 poor but free citizens from any political power. Is that truly a democracy just because the majority, the rich in this case, are in control? Or what if a small, organized group of poor citizens dominates a much larger but less politically active group of wealthy people? Is that an oligarchy just because the ruling group is technically a minority?
Those examples really show how those simplistic definitions just fall apart.
Right. And so the source offers a more precise definition. Democracy is about control by the free citizens, who usually are the majority and often the poorer folks. And oligarchy is about control by the wealthy citizens, who are usually fewer in number and often more concerned with their social status or breeding. It boils down to who holds the reins of the Constitution.
Okay, that distinction based on control of the Constitution makes a lot more sense in the real world of politics. You mentioned there are different kinds of both democracy and oligarchy. How does the source explain that?
They use a helpful analogy comparing it to how we classify animals, which I think really helps to grasp this. If you want to understand different animals, you first need to know the essential parts that every animal has to have. Things like sense organs, a mouth to eat, a stomach to digest, and a way to move around. But once you've got those basics down, you realize that within each category, there can be a ton of variation. Different types of mouths for different diets, different stomachs for different kinds of food, different sense organs depending on the environment, and different ways of moving, walking, flying, swimming. It's these different combinations of variations in those essential parts that create all the different kinds of animals we see.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So the essential parts of a state or a political system can also vary, and those variations lead to different constitutions and practice.
That's it. And then the source gets specific about what those crucial political parts of a city are, going beyond just basic survival like food. They're talking about the parts that directly affect governance and power.
Right, because a political community isn't just about surviving. It's about how it governs itself.
Exactly. So beyond the folks focused on food production, the farmers and the vulgar classes working in crafts, making essential or luxury goods, the textless, the traders, the laborers, and the military, which they see as absolutely vital for security and avoiding being conquered, which, is a critique of some earlier thinkers who didn't focus enough on defense.
That makes sense in the ancient world. But the need for a state to defend itself is definitely still relevant today.
Absolutely. Then there are those involved in justice-making decisions and giving judgments, and the part of the citizenry that deliberates on policy and judges disputes. This implies a need for citizens with a degree of civic virtue and political understanding. The wealthy are another part, often contributing through their property and resources. Then we have the officials needed to run the state day to day. And remember, some roles can overlap, but the text highlights one key division. You can't be both rich and poor. This economic division is crucial for understanding democracy and oligarchy, since those two groups often have different goals and often make up most of the population.
So we've got this complex web of different groups in a society, each with their own role and potentially conflicting interests.
Exactly. And now we can really dig into the specific types of democracy that the source lays out.
Yeah, let's dive into those different flavors of democracy.
The source describes several types, each with a different approach to participation and power. The first one is all about strict equality. The poor have no more power than the rich, and vice versa. It's this ideal of shared power and equal standing before the law.
That sounds like a really idealistic form of democracy, maybe even a bit theoretical.
It is an ideal. The second type is all about low property qualifications for holding office, so more people can participate as they gain some wealth. It introduces a meritocratic element tied to property. Then there are two types that really emphasize the rule of law. In one, all citizens who aren't legally barred can participate, but the law is the final authority. In the other, all citizens share in holding office just by being citizens, and again, the law is supreme.
So in these law-based democracies, there are clear rules and limits on how popular power works.
Precisely. But then the source describes a fifth type, and this one's different, potentially problematic. Here, the people themselves, rather than the law, have ultimate control. They govern through decrees and mandates, often swayed by charismatic leaders. They draw a direct comparison to tyranny.
Wow, that's a powerful comparison. It highlights the danger of rule by popular whim instead of by steady legal principles.
Exactly. They argue that in democracies where the rule of law is strong, you don't tend to see those powerful, charismatic leaders taking over. Instead, the most capable and virtuous people rise to the top. But when the laws are weak or ignored, then demagogues can step in and manipulate the people, essentially turning the entire population into a kind of unchecked monarch. They even question whether this extreme form is truly a constitution at all, because laws should be universal and apply to everyone, while decrees are specific and situation-based.
That's a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked popular power and how crucial a strong legal framework is, even in a democracy. Now let's look at the other main form, oligarchy. What are the different kinds outlined in the source?
Just like with democracy, there are a few variations. The first type is based on high property qualifications for holding office, so most poor people are excluded, but in theory, it's open to anyone who gets rich enough.
So it favors the wealthy, but there's at least a path for upward mobility in principle.
Yeah, there's some social mobility, though it's limited by that wealth requirement. The second type also has high property qualifications, but instead of open access, the officials themselves elect their replacements. If they choose from everyone who meets the criteria, it leans more towards aristocracy, where merit matters even within the wealthy class. But if they only choose from a smaller group, it stays more oligarchic, with power potentially becoming more entrenched. The third kind is hereditary rule, where political positions are passed down through families. And the fourth type is the most extreme. Here, even the laws aren't the ultimate authority. The ruling officials themselves operate without much constraint. This is the oligarchic version of tyranny, or that extreme democracy we talked about, often called a dynasty or a ruling clique above the law.
So in both democracy and oligarchy, the danger seems to be when things become too personalized, when individuals or small groups act outside the law.
Absolutely. And the text makes another point that's really important for anyone in politics. How a state is actually governed day to day might not perfectly match its official constitution. Customs, traditions, the influence of powerful individuals, these can all lead to a city being run more democratically than its oligarchic laws would suggest, or vice versa. This is especially true after big constitutional changes, when old habits and power dynamics die hard.
That really shows how important it is to understand the reality on the ground, the unwritten rules and power plays, not just the legal documents. Now, we briefly mentioned aristocracy and polity before. How are those defined in relation to democracy and oligarchy?
The source points out that the polity often gets overlooked, but it's a really important concept. Basically, it's a mixture of both oligarchical and democratic elements. It's interesting they say that mixtures leaning more towards democratic principles are usually called polities, while those leaning towards oligarchy are often called aristocracies. This is because qualities like education and good breeding, which were traditionally associated with aristocracy, were often seen as being more common among the wealthy.
So the idea behind a polity is to find a balance, a synthesis between the two.
Exactly. And the text outlines some practical ways to create that blend. One is to combine laws from both systems. For example, with jury duty, an oligarchy might fine wealthy people who skip it, but not pay the poor for serving. A democracy might do the opposite, pay the poor, but not fine the rich. A polity might do both, pay the poor and fine the rich, encouraging participation from everyone. Another way is to find a middle ground between the typical requirements of each system. For example, membership in the assembly might have no property requirement in a democracy, a very high one in an oligarchy. A polity might set a moderate requirement, allowing more people than an oligarchy, but not everyone like a democracy. A third approach is to pick and choose specific elements from both systems. For example, having officials elected, which is often seen as oligarchic, but not requiring them to be wealthy, which is more democratic.
So a well-designed polity should show signs of both democracy and oligarchy in its structure and practices.
Absolutely. And the text even uses Sparta as an example of a mixed constitution that was debated a lot back then. It had democratic elements like shared upbringing and education, communal meals, and electing officials like senators and overseers. But it also had oligarchic elements, like those elected officials having significant power and a smaller group making key decisions about life and death, exile, and so on. The point is, in a stable and well-mixed polity, you should see both elements, and no major part of the citizenry should fundamentally want to switch to a completely different system.
That idea of balance leading to stability really resonates with the challenges of political leadership today.
It does, doesn't it? And this leads right into the text discussion of the importance of the middle class. They argue that the best constitution and the best life for most people is found in the middle, where the middle class thrives.
Right.
This ties into the idea of virtue as a mean between extremes. A strong middle class helps keep things stable because they're less likely to be involved in the extreme conflicts that you see in societies with huge wealth gaps.
It makes sense. They don't have the same motivations for radical change as either the very rich who fear losing what they have or the very poor who feel they have nothing to lose.
Precisely. The text suggests that the rich tend towards arrogance and are more prone to crime, while the poor can become resentful and petty. The middle class is less likely to try to dominate or resist authority. They tend to be more reasonable and focused on the common good. They act as natural mediators. They even link the rise of tyranny to situations where the middle class is weak and the extremes gain control. And historically, many great lawmakers came from the middle class, people like Solon and Lycurgus. They had a balanced perspective and understood the needs of different groups.
So if a balanced polity and a strong middle class are so good for stability, why do most systems we see end up as either democracies or oligarchies?
It often comes down to the size of the middle class. When it's too small or weak, either the wealthy or the poor end up taking over, pushing the constitution in their direction. And conflicts between groups, driven by self-interest, also make it hard to maintain that middle ground.
It seems like building a strong middle class isn't just an economic goal, it's also a fundamental requirement for a stable political system.
Absolutely. And this brings us to something the source calls deceptive practices in constitutions. These are sneaky ways to tilt the balance of power without actually changing the structure.
Sounds like the kind of political maneuvering that never goes out of style.
Uh-huh.
What are some of these tactics?
They're subtle, often found in oligarchies. It's all about looking like you're including more people while actually keeping power in the hands of a few. The text points to 5 areas where this happens: attending assemblies, holding office, serving on juries, owning weapons, and athletic training.
Okay, can you give some examples of how this plays out?
Take attending assemblies. They might say everyone can participate, but then slap huge fines on wealthy people who don't show up, while poor people get off scot-free. So the wealthy are less likely to attend, and the assembly might end up dominated by the poor, who are then more easily influenced. For holding office, they might force the wealthy to serve if chosen, but readily excuse the poor. This skews the office holders towards the wealthy. Same goes for juries fining the rich for not serving but letting the poor off easy. Weapon ownership can be manipulated too. Maybe poor people are allowed to not have weapons without penalty, but the rich get fined if they don't. This subtly reinforces the military dominance of the elite. And lastly, they might not punish the poor for not participating in athletic training, but fine the rich if they don't.
So it's all about subtly encouraging or discouraging participation from certain groups to influence the outcome.
Right, and democracies have their own versions of this, like paying poor people to attend assemblies or serve on juries, with no corresponding obligation for the wealthy. The source argues that a just system, a hallmark of a polity, would be more balanced. Maybe offer some compensation to get the poor involved, but also impose some duty on the wealthy to contribute.
And they also talk about the importance of who's armed in a society for the type of constitution you have.
Yes, the ideal for a polity, they say, is a citizenry that can bear arms. But figuring out the property qualification for that can be tricky. They suggest aiming for a level where those included outnumber those excluded. The idea is that the poor will generally be peaceful as long as they aren't treated unfairly. But that requires the government to be just. Historically, they point out that early Greek constitutions after monarchy were often based on warriors, first the cavalry, then the hoplite infantry.
So the right to bear arms has historically been tied to the right to participate in politics and wield influence.
Precisely. And to help us analyze constitutions in more detail, the source breaks things down into 3 essential parts.
Okay, what are those 3 building blocks of any political system?
First, you have the deliberative body, the part that makes the big decisions. War and peace, alliances, laws, choosing officials, all that. Second are the offices themselves, the roles in the government, what they do, how people get appointed to them, how long they serve. And third, the judicial system, or from the courts, what cases they handle, and how judges or jurors are chosen.
Those sound like the foundations of any government. Let's start with the first one, the deliberative body. How is that organized differently in different systems?
In a democracy, the key thing is that all citizens have the right to deliberate on all matters. But even within that, there are different ways to do it. Maybe citizens take turns on different issues, or they all meet in assemblies to discuss everything. Sometimes officials prepare the issues beforehand. In more moderate forms, citizens might only gather for the most important stuff, electing leaders, making big laws, deciding on war, while other things are handled by selected officials. In the most extreme democracies, citizens might meet for almost everything, with elected officials just facilitating the process. It basically becomes ruled by the People's Assembly.
So even within democracies, the level of direct citizen involvement in decision-making can vary a lot. What about in oligarchies? How does deliberation usually work there?
In oligarchies, it's typically restricted to a select group, usually based on wealth or property. Again, there are variations. More moderate ones might have those with a certain level of wealth deliberating within the framework of laws. In more restrictive ones, a smaller group might be elected to deliberate but still bound by law. In the most extreme forms, it's a small, self-selected group, sometimes even hereditary, that basically controls the laws themselves. Now, in mixed systems like aristocracies or polities, you might see important matters decided by a broader assembly of citizens, while routine stuff is left to elected officials or smaller councils. You can also have a mix of elected officials and those chosen randomly for different tasks.
And are there ways to improve these processes in different types of constitutions?
The source thinks so. For democracies that risk becoming unstable due to unchecked popular rule, it might be good to borrow some ideas from oligarchic courts, like imposing penalties for not participating in deliberations to ensure broader engagement. Encouraging more structured discussions between different groups in society, like between the general public and more experienced citizens, can also lead to better decisions. In oligarchies, it might be beneficial to get more input from a wider range of people, maybe through advisory bodies or by having proposals reviewed by a larger group before the elite make the final call. This can help prevent things from becoming too self-serving without completely changing who's in charge. There are also different ways to think about how the people give input, like letting them veto decrees instead of just approving them, or vice versa.
That's a lot to think about when it comes to structuring deliberation. Okay, let's move on to the second part, the offices within a state.
This one's trickier than you might think. Defining what exactly a political office is can be tough. A society needs supervisors and administrators, but not everyone chosen by election or lot actually holds a political office in the truest sense. Priests, festival organizers, heralds, ambassadors, these are often chosen by the people, but might not have the same direct political power as those who make laws or judge cases. Real political offices, they argue, are about deliberating on policy, making legal judgments, and most importantly, giving commands. That's the essence of ruling. The number and types of offices also depend on the size and complexity of the state. Larger cities can have more specialized roles, while smaller ones might have to combine responsibilities. And there are big questions about how centralized the control of offices should be, whether they should be divided by function or by representing different groups.
And do the same types of offices tend to exist in different constitutions, even if they're filled by different sorts of people? The educated in an aristocracy, the wealthy in an oligarchy, the free citizens in a democracy?
Good question. Some basic functions, like justice and military command, are needed everywhere. But the specific offices and how important they are can definitely change depending on the Constitution. For example, having preliminary councils that set the agenda for larger assemblies might be seen as more oligarchic, since it concentrates power in a smaller group. A big popular council might be seen as more democratic, but it could become oligarchic if membership is too restricted. The back and forth between smaller, specialized councils and larger, more inclusive assemblies can be a key part of a mixed constitution. It's a system of checks and balances.
It seems like the question of how are officials chosen can reveal a lot about how power works in a constitution. Now let's get to that third part, the judicial element.
The judicial system, that third pillar, is super important for stability and how any state functions. The source highlights three key things about a state's courts. Who are the judges or jurors chosen from? What kind of cases do they handle, and how are they chosen? Lot, election, or something else? And they go on to list and briefly describe 8 different kinds of courts that a state might have.
8 different kinds. What are they all?
There are courts for inspecting officials, courts for general public offenses, courts for constitutional matters, courts for disputes about fines, courts for private contracts, courts for homicide, that's broken down further into premeditated murder, involuntary manslaughter, cases where killing is admitted but justified, and cases involving exiles returning home, and finally, courts for cases involving foreigners, both disputes between foreigners and disputes between foreigners and citizens.
Wow, that's a lot of courts. So how do all those different types of courts fit into the broader picture of constitutions?
Well, the source is mostly concerned with what they call the political courts, the ones that are most important for keeping the whole system stable. They're especially interested in the courts that deal with holding officials accountable, constitutional matters, and potentially serious crimes.
That makes sense, focusing on the courts that have the biggest impact on how power is used and controlled.
Exactly. Now, when it comes to how judges or jurors are chosen for these courts, there are a few different options. You could have all citizens judging all cases, either through a lottery, an election, or a mix of both. Or you could have a select group of citizens judging all cases, again, chosen by lot, election, or a combination. And then you have systems where some jurors are chosen from the whole citizenry and others from a specific group.
Okay, so the way those judicial roles are filled can tell us a lot about the kind of constitution a state has.
Absolutely. If everyone is judging everyone, it's more democratic. If a select group judges everyone, it leans towards oligarchy. And a mix of both suggests an aristocracy or a polity.
That wraps up this deep dive into the different forms of constitutions and their key features.
This is a pretty thorough exploration of how constitutions function, their different types, and the core principles that underpin them.
It's really eye-opening to see how these ancient ideas about political systems can be applied to the challenges facing political leaders today.
Absolutely, and it makes you think, what can we learn from these different models, from their strengths and weaknesses, to build more stable and just societies today? It's a question worth pondering.
Indeed. Food for thought for all the political leaders out there. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
My pleasure. Until next time.